Good day. I'm Vincent Sackstetter, and this is the After the Age of Fire channel. This is episode 29, recorded January 31st, 2026. The title is Why We Don't Get the Best from the World's Land. The land doesn't give us as good a harvest as we could get, and I'll explain why that is. But first, what sort of channel is this? This is a prepping channel, but not your average prepping channel. I'm not prepping for, I think it will help you be more resilient against, say, the next financial meltdown or war or whatever, but that's not really the thing I'm aiming for. I'm aiming for the huge transition that the human race is in right now. We've been, for the last 250 years, multiplying our consumption of everything, doubling it every 22 years or so, so every generation has averaged across the world's population around twice as much as the previous generation. And this is coming to an end around now, give or take 20 or 30 years. And sometime soon it will be over, and we won't be able to increase year on year. And moreover, it looks like we'll have actually a little less energy and other resources per person than we do now. Right now, we consume about, averaging again across the whole world's population, about 46,000 calories of fuel that we burn, and another 15,000 of food, fodder, and wood. Included in the fuel is the renewables and stuff. So for a total of around 60,000 calories, and it looks like we'll have something more like 20 or 15,000 calories of fuel and renewables and so on, and then it's perhaps still the same 15,000 of food, fodder, and wood. So I've been in the first, this is episode 29. The first, these first 30 or so episodes have been about looking at how we have been expanding our consumption of everything and what that's looked like, and what we spend it on, and what that energy goes for, and then assessing in detail how much we'll be able to get from the different sources long term, like coal, oil, and gas. We covered those. Sooner or later, it's not like they'll completely disappear, but it'll just be harder to mine and drill them, and we'll find that it's not worth our effort, at least if we want to continue living in the ease that we live in today. We won't be willing to go to the effort to do, say, send armies underground to mine coal when we've gotten out of the habit of doing that. So there will be less of them on offer, and then there's the renewables, and I've explained twice now in considerable detail why they'll never be able to provide anything like the 46,000 calories per person per day that we consume. And then the last option is, of course, the world's plants, whether we can get more from the world's forests and farmland and pasture land. And that's what I've been talking about starting around episode 21, 22, and the last few episodes we're talking about trying to improve that with genetics, so genetics and breeding. So episodes 24 to 28 was talking about how we could maybe improve plants to give us better harvests, and I finally came to the end of that in the previous episode 28. No, it was 27. I told you not to expect even a 10% improvement in our harvest over the next 40 years or so, and at least not one that comes from breeding and genetic engineering. So I'm talking about our worldwide harvest, the 15,000 calories of food, fodder, and wood. Don't expect breeding and genetic engineering to even give us a 10% improvement on that. And in general, the improvements that we do get will be small, even seeing into the next century or two. and they'll be for particular crops in particular places in particular circumstances. We'll get better results when we focus on particulars, on small things, and we'll get worse results, smaller percentages, when we try to do broad changes. And then even when we do get an improvement, it'll be sort of probabilistic, like in a particular season, if there's a little less water, we'll so we're calculating the probabilities that of more water or less water, and so on. Then maybe we'll get a better improvement, or we won't get any improvement at all. So we're coming to the end of that, and right now we're doing the last step of assessing what we can get from the world's plants, and that's looking at how much we can help with giving them better land and more water. And there's a big potential improvement here. It's a factor of 5. The difference between our crop's performance on the best land, the world's best cropland, and the average plant harvest, our crops are just natural vegetation, average across all the world's land is a factor of 5. The best land does a factor of 5 better. So if we could bring the average up closer to the best, we could get an improvement, maybe even a factor of 2, I don't know. And I'll be talking about what we would need to do. So this episode we'll be talking about what we're doing wrong and why we're not getting the best we could. And the next episode we'll be talking about how we could get the best harvest from the world's land. And then that'll be episode 30. And we'll also be this episode I won't be talking so much about improving what we could do specifically about giving our crops more water. The next episode will also cover water, and about how long it would take and what sort of effort it would take. It would take enormous effort for us to double our harvest. But we have 8 billion people at this point spread around the world, and maybe if we take a century or two of hard work from most of the human race, working intensively on improving the land's harvest, maybe we could get there. Maybe we could double our harvest from 15,000 calories to 30,000 calories. And I'll be talking about that in the next episode. And then episode 31 will be, should we, the morality or ethics of this kind of intervention. So what am I prepping for in this channel? I'm prepping for the process that we're going through right now of seeing the end of exponential growth, where we'll no longer be able to measure our success by some percent expansion of some number like money or income or wealth, and what it'll be like to live without that sort of expansion, and what it will be like to live in a world where there's less resources, still a lot more than people had 200 years ago, but significantly less resources than we can count on today, and how you will be able to thrive, and your family line can thrive and reproduce and continue in the new world, because it is certainly going to be a completely different world than the one we've lived in for the last 250 years. We've been in an extraordinary time, but that time is coming to its end, and we're going into another extraordinary time, and I'm talking about how to prep for that and how to do your best to try to ensure that your own family line, the people in your family, make the choices that it would require to do well, to actually have children. Many families just aren't having many children, and they're dying out. And how do you be one of the families that reproduces, multiplies, and flourishes in the new conditions? How do you do well in the new world? So let's get into it. the basic thing I'm saying in this episode is that right now we're engaged in damaging and destroying our land. Any land that we try to use, we end up damaging, and often we eventually just destroy it. And I'll describe as we go on how we do that and why we do it and how it works. But first, I just want to give one example with numbers, and it's erosion. This is just a lead off, and then I'll go into other examples. This is just one way of destroying land. Okay, and I'm going to talk about 1 square meter of land and how much soil it generates, it regenerates in a year, and how much soil is typically eroded. So let's talk about 1 square meter of cropland that's being farmed using the modern industrial mechanized techniques, using tractors and fertilizer and combines to harvest it and so on. Just standard modern farmland. And this farmland, even though for our farmland we tend to pick, we do pick the world's best land for our farmland, still our farmland only delivers a harvest that's roughly equal to the average worldwide, averaging across all the world's land, including deserts and savannas and places where it's just difficult for plants to grow. And I've mentioned that before, and we'll be unpacking in this episode why our farmland does so poorly, that it only, even though it's the world's best land, it only delivers a harvest it only harvests around 1 out of 300 sunlight calories, which is roughly the average worldwide. So 1 square meter of cropland, average cropland, will harvest from the sunlight that it receives. It will harvest about 10.5 calories per day that it'll turn into dry plant material, or turn into any plant material. It'll get 10.5 calories, and that'll summing up that over a year. That's close to 4,000 calories of that you'll get from 1 square meter of cropland in a year, and or around 900 grams of dry plant material per year. So what I'm saying is, looking around, not just our cropland, but average land around the world, on average we'll get we'll harvest close to 4,000 calories or 900 grams of dry plant material. More than that of wet plant material, a few thousand grams of wet plant material. Living plant material. Now, if with cropland, out of those 900 grams, only 450 grams will be grain. That's what we'll eat later on, and then there will be around 500 grams that we don't eat. The leaves and the stalks and so on. Okay. Now, so that's 500 grams left over that doesn't go to us, and then we have some choices about what to do with those 500 grams. We may just leave them on the land, and they'll get plowed under, and with the next plowing, or we may burn the field after we harvest it. There are reasons to do that, because it actually fertilizes the field. When you burn the crop, some of the nutrients then become ready for the next planting. Or we might, instead of burning the stalks and the leaves on the land, we might gather them and burn them somewhere else for our own purposes, perhaps even for fueling an electrical generator. Or a fourth option is we might use them as silage. There are corn, for instance. You can grow it and harvest it early before the grains are completely grown, but you harvest not only the grains, but you harvest the whole plant. Then you chop it up into little bits, and you stack it all in an airtight building, and you let it ferment for some months. And after that's called producing silage. And after you take this chopped up corn that's fermented, cows actually like to eat it, so they'll eat all of the stuff that grows on the field, not just the corn cobs. That's silage. So we can do all these things. One of them is to leave the plant on the land. Another one is to, and the other one is to burn it on the land, so at least its nutrients stay on the land, and the other two involve removing the plant material for our own purposes. So out of those 500 grams of dry plant material, or a couple kilograms perhaps of stalks and leaves, if they're not dried out yet, typical land around the world, and I'm reporting the results of scientific studies, will generate between 30 and 100 grams of new soil. So suppose you take this crop and you plow it under. Some of it will rot and will and some of it will turn into soil. Some of it will be eaten, and some of it will turn into soil. Now it's hard to measure this number precisely, and it varies enormously from field to field, season to season, and place to place. But still, it's roughly correct, 30 to 100 grams of new soil per square meter per year. And it certainly can't be larger than 400 grams, because 400, or it can't be more than a fraction of 500 grams, because most of the 500 grams that we leave behind on the field will not turn into plant material, will not turn into soil. So that's how much land can replenish itself. Okay, somewhere around 30 to 100 grams of new soil per square meter per year. Now let's compare that to the soil loss on our cropland. Okay, and we can talk about different kinds of soil loss, different kinds of erosion. Okay, and I'll start with the one called rill and interrill erosion. That means when water on the land moves smoothly, fairly smoothly, but with no deep channels, no gullies, no streams, just the farmland is being well preserved. It's just water's moving across it, and then eventually it gathers on the edge of the farmland and goes into a stream or something. Okay, and this kind of, but it's still, while it's flowing across your farmland, it will carry some dirt with it. And again, it's hard to say for precisely that, but the best estimates are that on average this kind of erosion will take away from a square meter of land about 1.3 kilos per year. You won't see a lot of dirt moving in the water, but it might look a little brown, or if you let the water collect somewhere, you'll see some dirt collecting at the bottom. It's not. It doesn't look like the land's. In fact, the land doesn't look like it's washing away. It's just a tiny bit, but over a year, it'll be a little more than a kilo per square meter. Again, this varies from place to place and year to year. Then that's 1.3 kilos being lost just from this rill and interrill erosion. Then there will be comparable amounts being lost. This is averaging across the world's cropland. Okay, a kilo or more from gullying, because gullies do happen, and when there is a gully, it erodes like crazy. Okay. There's also wind. wind blows away dirt, and especially if you leave the land uncovered, as many as we often do during the winter or even during the summer. Large amounts of land are left partially covered or completely uncovered, and the wind will blow it away. You may not notice it, but it just a little bit's blowing. And another way is when we cut down a forest. As soon as we cut down a bit of forest, a lot of dirt will wash away. And all of these are contributing somewhere around a kilo per square meter per year. There are other kinds of erosion too. There's something called tillage erosion. When you plow a field, the plow will tend to move soil either from the left to the right or from the right to the left. And in particular, if you're plowing on a hill, the soil will tend to move downhill every time you plow. So after a while, the hilltop will be bare of dirt, and the dirt will have migrated to the bottom of the hill. Even I'm not even talking about a steep hill. Just a shallow gradient. It'll still move downhill. That's called tillage erosion. There's also harvest erosion, which is suppose you have peanuts. You're growing peanuts. You have to dig the peanuts out of the ground when you harvest them. So you're digging up large amounts of ground and then sorting out the peanuts and trying to shake off the dirt and maybe wash off the dirt, and all that dirt erodes. I mean, some of it will go back in the ground, but you've loosened it up so well and flung it about, so now there's a substantial amount of erosion. There's also it's very common nowadays that farmers will want to terrace their land, so make it flat, so that they can build greenhouses on it, or they just like it flat. When you build a terrace, you'll have erosion, and then when the terrace collapses, you'll have erosion again. So taking all of these together, we're talking on average on the world's cropland, some number like 2, 3, 4 kilos averaged across the world's cropland worldwide that are lost. Okay, most of those 2 to 4 kilos of soil loss are caused by the fact that we're plowing the land and we leave it uncovered most of the large amounts of the year. And another part of it is because we don't have small farms. We have large ones, and so when a gully forms or when the wind blows, it'll blow. The wind picks up speed as it blows across a big field, and so. So that's just modern farming practices, big fields, plowing and leaving the land uncovered a large portion of the year. And therefore we lose these several kilos of soil per square meter per year. And that's far larger than the amount that the soil is able to regenerate, which, as I told you, was between 30 and 100 grams. It's in fact, it basically means that it's all loss. Almost nothing is being regained. The amount that land is able to regenerate is almost nothing. It's a couple percent compared to how much it's losing on average. So we might as well just forget about its ability to regenerate itself under modern farming conditions. And what that amounts to is that with modern farming, it amounts to us eating our soil, roughly, or mining our soil. Our farms are mines, okay? We get from a square meter of land, we get 450 grams of dry grain or dry plant material, or if you're talking about maybe raw fruit, maybe 3 kilos of raw fruit or 6 kilos of green vegetables from that square meter of land. Okay, and meanwhile it's losing between 2 and 4 kilos of soil. So we're eating roughly the same amount of raw fruit or vegetables as the soil is losing. Or if you're talking about dry plant material, it's a bit less, 450. Anyway, we get the amount of dry plant material is a fraction of the soil that's lost. It's a quarter or a tenth of the amount of soil that's lost. So now the soil loss is a little less on pastures. Pastures tend to retain some grass and stuff, at least in most places. So they might lose on average 0.6 kilos per year, 600 grams of soil per year. But on the other hand, we get less from the pasture because a lot of the calories that grow in that pasture go to the goat or the cow, and not to us. So again, if you look at how much the pasture is losing compared to how much we're eating, it's still roughly we're still mining the pasture. Let me emphasize this again. As things stand, with our modern farming practices, we steadily eat away at the land, at its soil, okay, and it steadily loses soil, and the amount of soil that it loses is several times the amount that we eat. So we're effectively eating our land. It's a nice convenient kind of, it's not the same, it tastes better than dirt, but it's roughly the same concept. So let's move on to the next thing. How fast is this going? Okay, if I say we're losing 3 kilos of soil per square meter per year, well, a square meter, you look at how much soil that is on the spread across the square meter, and it's only 2 millimeters of soil spread across the square meter. So it doesn't look like much. In fact, you don't notice it. Unless there's gullying going on and things like that. So how long can we keep going, losing 2 millimeters per year from our cropland? And well, let me talk about an exceptional piece of farmland. It's the Great Plains of the United States, which was recently covered by glaciers, and when the glaciers retreated, they left between 1 and 2 meters of very good topsoil on the Great Plains. It's very deep, and it's really full of nutrients. It's wonderful, and it's wonderful topsoil. And so if that topsoil, 1 or 2 meters of topsoil in this exceptional land, if it loses 2 millimeters per year, that means it'll last between 500 and 1,000 years. That's without gullying and without dust bowls, which can blow away 10 or 20 centimeters in a few weeks, and it's without landslides and without terraces collapsing. It's under good management. Okay, it might last 500 to 1,000 years, and that's exceptional land. Okay. Other parts of the world, other cropland around the world, have less soil, so not a square meter, not a meter of topsoil, not 2 meters, but maybe half a meter of topsoil, and below that something that's not nearly as good, and below that clay, and they have less fertile soil, and often they have worse erosion. Okay, so in most of the world's land, the number of years remaining, losing 2 millimeters per year, is a few centuries, or sometimes less, sometimes 30 years. But in general, it might be a couple centuries before you run out of topsoil. So overall, the answer, how fast is this going, is it's hard to notice the change year on year. When you come back to a piece of land after a year and it's lost 2 millimeters, you won't notice. And if you come back 25 years later and you've grown from 5 years old to 30 years old, and the land has lost 5 centimeters, you won't notice. We don't notice these things. It's hard to notice generation on generation. You know, if a piece of land, now if there's a big gully that opens up, you may notice the gully. But this sort of just gradual losing 2 millimeters a year, we don't notice. Okay. On the other hand, it's you know, it's short term. You know, 100 or 200, or on the world's best land 1,000 years. That's short compared to human history. We're losing our land far faster than the human race has existed. We started writing things down 5,500 years ago. That's the official start of human history, because that's when we started recording what we'd done. Okay, but there are signs that we or people very like us, walking on 2 legs and so on, have been around for up to 3 million years. 1,000 years is a blink of the eye compared to that. So this is our loss of cropland is slow compared to a lifetime in most places, but it's far faster than the life of the human race. And maybe it's comparable to the lifetime of nations and civilizations. Nations and empires and civilizations tend to come and go on the scale of a few hundred years, sometimes maybe 1,000 years, which is roughly, and it's probably not an accident. A civilization that grew up well on a particular piece of fertile land will often not have fertile land 1,000 years later. So, it's a problem. It's a real problem. So, you know, in fact, by now we've spread across the world, and we've been using the world's land for a long time, and our eyes are good for assessing. I mean, we grew up looking at land and at plants and at animals on that land, and we were very, very interested in the food and everything else about the land, and we're really good at being able to figure out how land is doing. You can look at land, you can look at a forest, and you can tell whether it's doing well or not, whether it's been damaged or not. Okay, it's not that much different from being able to tell right from left, or telling whether a person is male or female, or telling whether somebody's alive or dead. We can do the same thing with land. But in fact, we don't let ourselves. We don't teach ourselves, and we don't think about it. We don't let ourselves think about whether the land we're looking at is doing well, whether it's been damaged or not. Okay, and we don't discuss it with each other. We don't let it enter into our conversation or into news reporting, or, you know, and we don't talk to our children. We don't teach our children. Well, now we're beginning to wonder whether we should teach our children whether they can tell who's male or female. Okay, but long ago we stopped teaching our children how to identify healthy land. But And the reason is pretty simple. It's because you look at anything around you, just about anywhere you can go, and you go outside your front door and you look, and just a little thought and maybe a little historical work will tell you very quickly that your neighborhood, your farm, your forest is far different today than it was a few hundred years ago. And it's still reeling from the effects of whatever happened over the last few centuries, or in some cases the last few millennia. If we let ourselves see and think about what the land around your house, around your farm, was like, try to imagine what that land was like, what was growing on it, and if you tried to build a picture of what that land looked like 1,000 years ago and what animals were living there and what's living there now, you'd just know that you were looking at devastated land in most cases. So we farm the best land, but actually it's a fact, we have abandoned by now more land than we are currently farming. So we use a substantial fraction of the world's land for farming, but already we've given over much of that land to become cropland, or just let it revert to doing whatever, letting whatever grows there grow, now that we're done using it, because it has degraded so much that it's no longer practically usable for us. And we continue to abandon cropland today. Over the last 40 years, we've abandoned something like 30% of our cropland. So on average, somewhere around 1% of our cropland is abandoned per year. So that's roughly in line with this time scale of a century before abandonment. Maybe 125, 150 years before we abandon an average piece of cropland the way we're going today. Some of our abandonment started already a very long time ago. For instance, the Tigris and Euphrates River Valley, the Tigris and Euphrates are in what's now Iraq, and they lead down to the Persian Gulf, and they flood regularly. So in the last several hundred kilometers, there's a wonderful farmland, or there was 2,500 years ago, and this is or 3,000 years ago. This is the cradle of civilization, one of the cradles, along with the Nile River Valley. And because it's very flat land, it's a river delta, and it's flooded very regularly with all the nutrients and things and soil that come from upriver. And it made wonderful land for the first large civilizations. And so, and then the two rivers join 150 kilometers before the Persian Gulf into one river called the Shat al-Arab. Who knows how long that has, they may have been two separate rivers until fairly recently. It's a typical delta system where there's water everywhere and lots of good farmland. But this land has a problem, that underneath the topsoil that's left by the river, there's a layer that doesn't let water through. And so when people started farming this land, they wanted to make it, they used irrigation to keep the land, to keep their crops growing. So they would move water into land that was dry because of the climate. and that water that they used to irrigate would stay on the land, and it would dry out, and it would leave any salt that was in it on the land. And that salt, it would, you bring in a lot of river water. The river water has only a small amount of salt in it, but after it's dried out, the water left on the land is more salty, and the land itself becomes more salty. Now, if the land didn't if the water had been, the salty water, leftover water, had been able to flow downward, then that land, the cropland, the topsoil, would not have grown more salty. But as it is, there's the water, the land, the clay or whatever underneath the topsoil does not allow water to move down, and it's trapped. So the salt is trapped in the cropland, and the cropland becomes salty bit by bit, year by year, and over centuries it becomes too salty for things to grow. And so the first civilization, the first major civilization, and this cradle of the world's civilization, was Sumer, and that was very near the Persian Gulf. But because it was very near the Persian Gulf, that's where the salt collected first. Okay, and after some hundreds of years, that land became less fertile, and so the next civilization, Sumer, fell, and the next civilization was a little bit upriver, was the Akkadian civilization, and then some hundreds of years later, a bit more upriver, was the Babylonian civilization, and then a bit further upriver was the Assyrian Empire. So there was a steady movement upriver as pieces of large tracts of farmland that had been some of the most fertile land in the world became too salty to grow things on. This is the place where the Garden of Eden would have been, if you believe what the Bible says about the Garden of Eden. It would have been somewhere in the Tigris and Euphrates River Valley. It was incredible land, and they irrigated it. The water the salt did not leave, the water evaporated, and the land became too salty to grow on. And so you had civilization after civilization replace each other, moving upriver, and and so you can't say for sure that this salinization problem is the only reason why those empires rose and fell. Okay, but it was certainly part of it. It was an important part of it. Okay, and in fact, salinization, salt continues to be a problem in certain parts of the world. There's a lot of irrigation worldwide, and some places you don't have the problem of accumulating salt, but in some places you do, and there every year you get a little more salt, and you know that after some centuries you won't be able to farm there, at least not the same species, and a lot less productively. In fact, even in the place closest to the Persian Gulf, until recently there were a lot of date palms, a huge forest of date palms growing dates. Dates are delicious sweet fruit, and in the last 50 years or so, it's become too salty even for the date palms to grow. And we can talk about other places. It can be hard to work out exactly what happened 2,000 years ago. This salinization, saltiness problem in present-day Iraq started 3,000 whenever they started farming, which was more than 3,000 years ago. But we could talk about Greece, for instance. Greece has mountains, and those mountains used to have dirt on them, and forests, and Some of them were farmed, and some of them were they just sent flocks to graze on those mountains, and the crops and the flocks gradually destroyed the forests, and then the soil just washed away. And so by now the large majority of Greece's mountains are just bare rock. And this was already, Plato complained about this. He described what had happened already by the time, and Plato was 2,500 years ago. He described how the mountains no longer were green. It's hard to be sure about Italy's farmland. Certainly Italy must have been a breadbasket, because it had to feed Rome and keep the Romans happy. There's the old phrase about bread and circuses, but it's hard to be sure exactly how much its land was damaged. They seem to be a little bit more aware of erosion and how to manage it. But certainly around the world, starting thousands of years ago, erosion has been an issue. And other sorts of damage to farmland. Now I'm going to just mention a few major things, and then I'll just mention them very briefly, and then I'll go into the last topic, which is our farming and how our farming contributes to the problem. This will be very brief, and then even the discussion of our farming and what it does to the land will still be pretty brief. So here's just a laundry list of ways that we damage the world's land. One is when we cut a forest. It's not just that it erodes the land. It's also that forests are very important for moving water around. Rainwater from this, so the clouds from the sea move inland, okay, but they typically let go of their water within 500 kilometers or something like that, close to the coast, and then if in order to move water further on, you need plants to receive the rainwater that they just received from the sea, and to re-evaporate it into the air, so that you'll get more clouds and they'll move further inland. If you don't have large amounts of plants absorbing water and evaporating it into the atmosphere, then the water won't move inland that far, and the interiors of the continents will be dry. Roughly 2/3 of the precipitation on land is water that was evaporated by plants. So you cut down a forest, as we've cut down an awful lot of forests by now, you're reducing the amount of rainwater. Another thing we do is we poison our land. Some of that is from mines. Mines release different poisons. Some of them are pesticides and for insects, and some of them are herbicides for diseases, plant diseases. Another thing we do is we put dams and dikes around our rivers. So we confine the rivers, and that means that they can't flood and they can't fertilize the soil around them. Another thing we do is strip mine, which I don't know, certain companies and powers claim that you can restore the land after a strip mine, but as far as I can tell, what you get back after you strip mine the land and then try to cover it with topsoil is just a death zone. And then there's something called mountaintop removal, where you find a vein of coal or something that's under, I don't know, say 100 meters or 300 meters of rock at the top of a mountain, so you just blow away the top of the mountain, and so that you can uncover the coal or whatever you're trying to get at. And then there's the way that our the world's wetlands have largely disappeared because of the way that we confine our rivers and route them around and get rid of marshes in the way that we're very interested in our coasts, and we have uses for almost all of the world's coastland, and the mangroves are disappearing. So those are, and you could expand on any of these, but I'm not going to. This is just a laundry list. What I do want to talk about in a little more detail is what we do with our farmland and how we interfere with it. And I want to describe briefly how plants normally grow, so I can contrast that with what we do to farmland. And this will give you this. By the time we're done with this rather brief discussion, you'll understand why our farming practices today degrade our farmland as much as they do. Normally, if we are leaving land alone, you'll have many species growing on the same land, and the individual plants will have different ages. Some will be young, a few days old, and some will be 5 years old, and some will be a century old, and they help each other out. There is a competition, okay, but it's a kind of helpful competition, because if one plant doesn't get the sunlight, doesn't harvest the sunlight, another plant will make sure to do it. They're always, and they feed each other, so one plant rots and the other one grows from the nutrients released by, and they produce, the whole community produces soil. They're helping each other out in many, many ways, and I'm not going to attempt to detail them all. Okay. And they keep the land covered with leaves all year, well, except for maybe the winter and places where the winters are cold, but they make sure that the land is covered. So, and if one species fails, if there's a new disease that comes in and kills all the elms, okay, or all the oaks, well, another species will step right in and take over, okay, and take care of the harvesting the sunlight, make sure to absorb all the sunlight and to maintain the soil. So there's no one point of failure, nothing, and so it just keeps going. Just no matter what you do to one species, the land will keep going. Okay. And moreover, when soil is disturbed, it is disturbed slowly. Maybe roots growing around, moving through the soil, or anyway, it's not huge amounts of soil being turned over. And the roots that these plants send down, even grasses, even fairly small plants, not even trees, but trees too, the roots grow deep. Grasses might grow roots that are several meters deep and rather wide, meters wide. And those roots, the roots are made larger than you would think, just looking at the plant itself, because around roots there are networks of fungi, of fungus. These are called mycorrhizal fungi that grow in a web around the roots and extend out into the dirt, and they actually make, it's more or less making the roots much larger, even though it's a different species or many different species cooperating to help the grass, for instance, with its roots. Okay, and these fungi, they also, these webs in the dirt, they also keep the dirt together. They bind it together and give it some of its consistency. Now, what is dirt? Dirt starts out being, before plants arrive, suppose you, it'll be clay and sand, and maybe some rocks mixed in. But as plants grow there, they leave their plant material in the dirt. Okay, when they die, or their roots extend into the dirt, and different organisms grow in the dirt and die in the dirt, and all of that, or maybe the feces of worms or whatever are left in the dirt and get mixed in, and the dirt gradually becomes a mixture not just of sand and clay, but also of plant material and material from animals, and that's when it turns into what I'd call soil. Soil is something with a lot of biological material in it, some of it alive, like the fungi that I was mentioning, and some of it dead. And soil retains water better than sand does, or clay, and it therefore retains nutrients better, because if you have a plant growing in sand, then when the water would flow into that sand, suppose it rains, the water would go into the sand and would immediately take away any nutrients that were mixed into the sand. But this soil is different. It holds the water and it holds the nutrients, and therefore the plants can grow better. You know from previous episodes that a plant needs 600 kilos of water for every kilo of dry plant material. So that water is enormously important to a plant's harvest, and therefore a plant needs good soil to keep the water in place to be ready for when it needs it. Now, in the soil, all of these things mixed together, the clay, the sand, the plant animal material, and the water that's being held, okay, in that soil there's a community of thousands of species growing around the plant's roots. Species like bacteria or nematodes. Nematodes are a kind of worm that doesn't have segments, rings, or worms. The kind of earthworms that we think of are sort of rings stacked on each other. So different kinds of worms, and then there are insects and there are fungi, all of these growing in the soil, and the plants when they grow in soil, their roots feed this ecosystem. The ecosystem, all these fungi and bacteria and stuff, they can't harvest sunlight because they're not above ground. They're not photosynthesizing. Okay, they depend. The only way that they can get their energy is from a plant's roots, and plants deliberately feed all of these organisms underneath them in the ground, and they also control them. They use hormones and other things to control what organisms are growing around their roots, and the reason why they do, and they get something in return, of course, from this ecosystem. I say ecosystem, but more properly, the word is probably rhizosphere. Rhizo is the Greek word for root, and rhizosphere means that volume of soil around a plant's roots that's being fed by the plant's roots, and that's full of extra organisms that wouldn't be there if the plant weren't there, and is working together with the plant to help it grow. Okay, and all these organisms growing around the plant help it in many ways, and one of them is to protect the plant that's feeding them from organisms that might want to eat the plant, and another one is to feed it nutrients. So even if you have soil that's full of, say, phosphorus, okay, it's not just because it has phosphorus in it doesn't mean that phosphorus is good for the plant, that the plants growing in that soil will be able to use it. It depends on what sort of chemicals the phosphorus is part of. And there are many chemicals phosphorus containing chemicals, and that plants are just unable to access. Okay, and therefore, but bacteria may be able to pull out the phosphorus from these chemicals and change it to a form into another chemical where plants can use it. So plants are unable for most forms of phosphorus to use that phosphorus, and they really need bacteria and other organisms to process the phosphorus so it will be in a form that they can use. The same thing with potassium. The big three nutrients that a plant needs are nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, and then there's some other micronutrients. And potassium and phosphorus are often in a form that in the soil that is just unusable for a plant, and so the plant requires all these other organisms in the ecosystem around its roots to help it out. Or another nutrient that they need is nitrogen. That's one of the big three. The atmosphere is 80% nitrogen, and then but plants can't get the nitrogen directly from the air. Instead, organisms growing underground are able to what's called fix nitrogen, and I think in particular beans tend to help these organisms grow. So you grow a crop of green. Many people will grow a crop of beans during the winter because those beans will replenish the nitrogen in the soil. Not the bean plant itself, but the bean plant is feeding some organisms in the ground that are busy fixing nitrogen during the winter. So then you don't harvest the beans, you just plow them under, and then in the spring you plant something else that will use the nitrogen. So my point is that in the soil there's a huge community of organisms that are being fed by the plant and by its roots, but are also taking care of the plant. And that's in addition to all the plants, all the species that are growing together above ground in normal. That's how nature usually does things. Now let's contrast that to how we farm land, okay, and how things are different when we farm land. Well, first of all, we don't plant many species together. We plant what's called a monoculture. We say, oh, I want corn. Okay, so you take a large tract of land and you plant corn on it, and you try to make sure that corn is the only thing growing on that land. Okay, which means that the plants, other species, the plants aren't helping each other. And if there's some sort of blight or something comes along that likes to eat your corn, and if your crop fails, there won't be any harvest, and nothing will capture the sunlight. So there's not this cooperative insurance that the sunlight will be harvested or anything like that. So that's one way to make sure that just by insisting that we plant only one thing grows on the land, okay, that's one way to make sure that our land that we use for our farming will harvest less energy than it would otherwise. And then another thing we do with our farming is we reproduce a major natural disaster at least once a year. We raise the land, we plow it under, we cut down the crop and we plow it under, and we disrupt. We don't just cut everything down on the land. We also overturn the soil. That's the only way that happens, except for our intervention, is when there's a major natural disaster. And that's why we have such a huge problem with weeds. Weeds are species that are adapted specifically to intervene quickly when there's been a natural disaster. They grow quickly and they harvest some sunlight until other species take over. But we raise the land, well, often more than once a year. We overturn it not only at planting but also at harvest for some crops, like for peanuts and potatoes and carrots and beets. We have to turn the land over when we harvest also, so that's at least twice a year. And then if we have several crops in a year, then it's many times in a year. So we have more of a problem with weeds because of the way we choose to farm our land. And there are long periods when the soil is just not fully covered, so between seasons when we're not growing anything, and also after you plant a new crop, there's a period that could last a month or 2 months when the plants are small and the leaves are small and they're not covering the land very well. So again, they're not capturing all the sunlight, okay? And then also because they're not covering the land, the soil loses its moisture, and it also tends to blow away, and water also runs away, and also the soil will bake in the heat. So our way of farming ensures that the soil will not get the care or the protection that it would if we weren't there. And then also we overturn the soil, as I mentioned, and when we overturn it, we expose it to light, and under sunlight, the plants that grow in the organisms that grow in the light, the organisms that grow in the soil die. Light is a great way of sterilizing soil, and therefore they're unable. So you plow your land, the organisms in it die, many of them, and therefore they're unable to feed nutrients to the plant that grows on them. You plant something and they're unable to. There just aren't as many organisms, and they're not as healthy, and they're not able to feed the plants that you've planted. Okay, and this situation is made worse by the pesticides and herbicides that we apply. And then another thing is we sever the roots. When we plow, we cut the roots, and so they can never grow long. In fact, our crops have short roots. They're not 2 meters long or 3 meters long the way a grass would grow if it were left there, if it left to grow for decades. Okay. So because the roots are not as long, they can't get to as much water, and they can't harvest as many nutrients from the soil, and the plant is more vulnerable. Okay. In fact, we breed our plants to have shorter roots and less leftover plant material. Why? Because we want to have more grain. So we've made our stunted grains, our dwarf rice and our dwarf wheat, that are shorter than they used to be. So there's less stalk and there's less leaves, but there's more grain for us. But because there's less stalk and less leaves, that means that they don't feed the soil as much. And also their roots are shorter, which means, again, they don't feed the soil as much, so they get less nutrients out of the soil, and so on. And then, as I've mentioned, we may remove or burn the plant material, so again, it's not feeding the soil. So we're starving the ecosystem, the rhizosphere that grows underground, and we're killing it with our plowing and our pesticides and our herbicides. So since there's less plant material in the soil with our farming techniques, there's less rhizosphere, less of this ecosystem, and the soil is less able to absorb and retain water, and there's more runoff, and there's more nutrient loss, and there's more erosion, and the soil dries out more quickly, so we have more problems with plants not having enough water. So after all this discussion, and really I've flown through it, okay, this is the material for oh, this is bottomless material. You could spend years on this, and it would be worth it. And I've talked about it for a few minutes, but it shouldn't be any surprise to you that after all, our cropland, even though it's the world's best land, it obtains a harvest that's only slightly better than the average of all the world's land. There was some scientists in 2018 tried to estimate the effects of our farming on the amount of plant material that's above ground. I mean, the amount of plant material, live plant material. So what they did was they were talking about if you took the plant material and you were to dry it out, so that's the amount of dry plant material, and what's the effect of a farm? Suppose you take a land that's been left without our intervention and you convert it to a farm, okay? How much less plant material is there on our farm compared to what was there before? And so that land, before we start farming it, will have 10 times as much plant material as after we farm it, because of how we're intervening, and also the fact that we're also just killing the crop every few months and taking off whatever we want and then making it regrow again. And then there are managed ecosystems, things like pastures, okay? And there our management ensures that on average worldwide the total amount of plant material growing on that managed ecosystem is around a third of what it would have been without our intervention. And overall, between our farming and our management, we really use a large fraction of the world's land. The human race has reduced the amount of living plant material by a factor of 2. The amount of living plant material on the world's surface is 1/2 of what it would be if we weren't intervening. Now these guys, they're trying to do estimates based on about what's happening everywhere around the world, and so there's a lot of I mean, they can't get this precisely correct, but this is their best estimate that we've divided the amount of living plant material by 2, and on managed ecosystems we divided by 3, and on our farms we divided by 10. So we do all these things with modern farming to our land, and it creates some problems, and of course we're aware of some of these problems and we need to do something about them. So we have a solution, okay, a modern solution, and our solution is to not treat the soil as an ecosystem, to not recognize that there are living things growing underneath the surface and helping the plants along, okay, but instead to think of the soil as basically dead. As far as we're concerned, it's no concern of ours whether there's worms or bacteria or fungi growing underneath our corn or our potatoes, more or less, give or take. So it's more or less the same approach as hydroponics. If you remember, hydroponics means that we don't want soil. We decide to use something that we've chosen, say plastic pellets or some kind of especially processed rock, or sand, and we grow the crop directly in buckets full of this hydroponic material, and then but this material doesn't have nutrients in it, so we force through the material steadily water that has been given a certain amount of nutrients in the right combination and a certain amount of oxygen, and we just force that through the hydroponic material, and we get plants that grow without dirt. Okay, and that's hydroponics for you, and that's more or less how we think of our farms. So we have land that, as far as soil that, as far as we're concerned, it might as well be dead, and then we add the fertilizer ourselves, and we add the water ourselves when necessary. So a modern industrial farm, sure, there are still things growing in that land, but that's no fault. That's not our fault. We could care less. We just want the crop, and we want the corn or the potato, and we're not doing anything to help it out with no, we're just applying the fertilizer that it needs. We're making sure that it gets water when there's not enough rainwater, and then we're following some schedule, and we're using our large machines to plow it and to harvest it and so on. It's a large outdoor factory floor. Or another way of saying it is the petri dish. Same concept as a petri dish. You fill your little plastic or glass dish with some material that has wonderful nutrients and things ready for your bacteria, and then you introduce your bacterium and it grows like crazy, and that's more or less what we want to do with our farmland. We just want something that's dead but has the right nutrients, so that our plants, when we plant the right seed, will grow. So that's the modern industrial farm. It's a wasteland. It has a crop growing on it, but the stuff underneath it is dead. Might as well. We don't care. Okay. We do care about planting the seeds at the right time, using the right tractors, and so on. So it all reminds me a bit of piracy, of looting. We grab the easy money and we run. That's what it reminds me of. And that's basically why we're not getting the best harvest from our land, and that's why our land keeps degrading. It loses so much of its vitality, and every year, and why we have to keep abandoning land and moving on to other land. It's because we're more or less deliberately killing the soil in order to produce the crops that we want. So that's really the main content of this episode. The next episode will be about how to get the best harvest from the world's land. And in a way, I've already answered that question. You just think about what we're doing in our farms, and how would you do differently. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Again, I'm going to fly through the material like I just did. This is material that could keep a billion people or several billion people busy for centuries trying to figure out how to do it right on any particular plot of land where they happen to be living. Okay. So I can't begin to do any kind of justice to this. I can only give the main idea, which is stop killing the soil. But it would require a lot of work, a lot of intervention from a lot of people for a long time. So the next episode, after this, the next episode will be how to get the best harvest from the world's land. Then episode 31 will be about the ethics or morality of it. Should we do this? Oh, and by the way, this next episode about getting the best we can from the world's land, then I'll finally talk about how we could give the land a bit more water. Very important. And then 31 will be, should we do this? Should we intervene in this way? And once we're finally through the next 2 episodes, then we'll have finally finished assessing how much energy the human race will have on the long run. We've already done coal, oil, and gas. We've already done the renewables, and we'll finally be done with talking about how much energy we can get from the world's land, from our crops, and from the forests. So, and with that, we'll be almost done with the first section of this channel. This channel, as I've told you before, has 3 stages. The first one is about the past, and we're finishing up this past, which is about exponential growth, our resource consumption, and how much energy we can reasonably expect to have long term. And we're coming down to conclusion that we're not going to have 46,000 calories plus 15,000 long term. We'll have a bit less than that. And then the next section will be about the present, because right now we're at a stage where the exponential growth is coming to its end, and we'll be assessing very soon where we stand in that progression. Has the exponential growth already ended? And then the last section will be about the future, and then we'll finally be talking about, with all this foundation material, we'll be talking about how to get ready for the future, prepping. So with that, I wish you a wonderful week. If you know anybody who you think might be interested in this content, please refer them to this content, and do keep coming back. Yeah.